Well, California seems to be a market that's very quiet, but also growing at a very rapid rate, it seems like, to the point where they might be adding a brand new terminal. What's going on, everybody? My name is Brandon. If you like cruise news, cruise vlogs, and ship tours, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below and hit that notification bell to be notified every time we upload a new video. Anyways, let's jump right in. So like I said, over the last probably decade or so, California and the Port of Los Angeles has been a very slow and I would almost even say a dead market. It used to be a very popular market back in the early 2000s, and it seems like maybe a spike in crime and just a lot of issues going on the western side of Mexico kind of caused that market just to die off, and not as many people wanted to go over to the West Coast anymore. But ever since the COVID shutdowns kind of lifted and everybody started cruising again, it seems like that market is starting to finally come back to life. And even now, it seems like it's getting to that point where they're going to add a brand new ship terminal in probably the next several years. It really never seemed like the market was going to recover over there. It'd been so long. And with Navigator of the Seas going over there after the COVID shutdowns were lifted, that was the first time Royal Caribbean has put a ship there in almost I would say maybe 12 years or so, if I'm accurate on that. It was definitely over 10, somewhere between 10 to 12 years. It's been a very long time since Royal Caribbean had a ship out of Los Angeles full time or year round. That just kind of shows what that market was like and how the lack of popularity it had for quite some time. One of the biggest disadvantages with the Mexican Riviera and just sailing out of California in the first place is, of course, just the lack of destinations as well. Set aside all the actual issues that truly led to the kind of shrinking and the downfall of that market in the late 2000s and early 2010s. There also is just kind of a disadvantage just because it's not the Caribbean. There's not an overabundance of different ports you can go to. 9 times out of 10, if you're on a 7-night sailing or less, which is about average here in the United States as far as cruising, you're limited to Catalina Islands, Ensenada, Mexico, Cabo San Lucas, Mazatlan, and Puerto Vallarta. All very, very beautiful ports. So I'm not saying anything against them. Very beautiful ports. I'm saying that's pretty much what you're limited to within those 7 days, and you're not going to reach all 5 of those ports within 7 days. Whereas the Caribbean, you have the ability to do a 7 to 8 day cruise all the way down to the Southern Caribbean to Aruba and Curacao. Those typically fall into the 8 day category, but still. Then you have, of course, the Eastern Caribbean, the Western Caribbean, Bahamas. There's just so many different places you can go. Jamaica, Grand Cayman, Mexico, Costa Maya, Mexico, Cozumel, Mexico, Roatan, Honduras, St. Martin, St. Thomas, St. Kitts. There's so many places that you can go in 7 days compared to where you can go on the West Coast. That's more of just comparing the two together. Again, there's nothing wrong with sailing out of Los Angeles and, of course, to the Mexican Riviera. Those are actually some of the prettiest ports that I've ever been to. Puerto Vallarta, Mazatlan have been some of the best places and my favorite places that I've been in a very long time. So definitely would recommend going over there. It's just, I guess my point behind that was that there's not a whole lot over there. If you're doing multiple cruises like me, who cruises 3 to 4+ times a year, which is probably above average for most people. But what I'm saying is after, 3 to 4 cruises, you've seen everything. But ever since the COVID shutdown was lifted and the restart happened, Los Angeles has been really picking up the pace. And ever since, I feel like the Carnival Panorama kind of led the way with that a little bit, just because that was the first time a brand new ship had been over there and stationed there all year long. Although the Panorama is related to Long Beach, which I believe is separate from the actual port of Los Angeles, although they are pretty much right next to each other. Any of the numbers that I mentioned in just a few minutes here, that actually excludes Long Beach. But my point is that market has picked up a lot ever since the arrival of Carnival Panorama, as that's the first time not only a large ship, but a brand new ship has been over there in quite some time. As of course she was the big third Vista class ship to come out in 2019. Unfortunately, just a few months before the shutdown occurred. But again, ever since the shutdown was lifted, the market seems to be doing really good. Panorama seems to be doing really well over there. And ever since, the Navigator of the Seas has been over there as well, which is a similar sized ship, a little bit older, yes, than the Panorama, actually much older, as Navigator is surprisingly and hard to believe, but that's a 20-year-old cruise ship now. But the Navigator is very, very nice. Of course, she has huge upgrades that were done recently to her just several years ago. So it seems like those two ships really led the way, especially because they're sailing year round from Los Angeles and Long Beach. And of course, and I feel like Carnival's actually being a little bit more aggressive over in that Mexican Riviera and just West Coast cruising market. Again, aside from the port of Los Angeles, Carnival has 3 ships, well, soon to be 3 ships, and they're newer, quote unquote, with like a little asterisk there, newer ships. Carnival Panorama, again, fresh out of the shipyard, went straight to Long Beach to start cruising from there. We have the Carnival Radiance that does 3 and 4 night cruises from Port of Long Beach, which, with an asterisk there, is a new ship. For those who don't know, the Radiance is actually originally the Carnival Victory, which is actually a ship that came out back in 2000. But she had a big renovation right at the end of the COVID pandemic, where she, of course, had a really big dry dock to the point where $200 million investment for that and ended up coming out as the Carnival Radiance. So technically flagged as a new ship, but still a 23, 24-year-old ship on paper, sort of. So that's why the little asterisk there kind of falls in when I call that a new ship. It's not necessarily a new ship. And then same thing with Long Beach is actually getting the Carnival Firenze, which is a Costa by Carnival ship. So again, not a new ship, but a new to Carnival ship and sort of. So she is a relatively new ship, and she actually is heading off to dry dock in just a few days. If you want a little bit more in-depth detail of Carnival Firenze, my most recent cruise news video before this one was all about her. I'll link it at the end of this video. And last year in 2023, the Port of Los Angeles actually had one of their best years in a very long time. May not be their all-time best, which was back in the early 2000s before the market kind of started to die off there, but one of their best years in a very long time, as they did see 1.3 million passengers come through the port throughout the year. And that's a lot to do with the influx of course, Princess having multiple ships out of there, and of course, Navigator of the Seas sailing there full time all year round. Of course, seasonally as well, that we have the Norwegian Bliss, and usually at least one Breakaway Plus class if it's not the Bliss, whether that's the Joy, the Encore, or the Bliss. Right now, it is the Bliss over there. But usually there's at least one of those ships sailing over out of Los Angeles during the winter seasons while they're not up in Alaska. So with all of those ships that are coming into the port, again, the market is starting to grow and get back up there. And again, not quite the original numbers from the early 2000s whenever those, whenever it was at its peak. But if this continues, they could be back to those numbers and surpassing and breaking those records any year now. So with all of that, it seems like they're getting at capacity, a similar problem that we're seeing here in Port Canaveral here on the Space Coast in Florida. We're running out of room, and there's a lot of ships coming in. It seems like Los Angeles may finally get a brand new cruise terminal. Now, this isn't coming anytime soon or within the next few years, but they do plan on a new cruise terminal to be added to the Port of Los Angeles by the end of the decade, so by 2030. So this is very exciting news and definitely something to keep on our eye on over the next couple of years. Again, this is not happening anytime soon, but this is something that we'll probably see within the next 5 years. As surprisingly, we're already in 2024 and we're almost halfway through this brand new decade, what it seems like. So by the end of this decade, by the end of the 2020s, we may see a brand new cruise terminal over in the Port of Los Angeles. And then last year was a pretty good year for the port. In 2023, 1.3 million passengers went through the port throughout the year. And again, those numbers don't include Long Beach, but 1.3 million passengers came through the port last year in Los Angeles. Now, the numbers are expected to decline in 2024, unfortunately, but not by much. And that's only because the Navigator of the Seas is actually scheduled for a dry dock, and she has to go all the way out to Singapore for it. So she will actually be exiting service for about a month, almost 2 months, to where that decrease in passengers and decrease in the amount of travelers through the Port of Los Angeles is due solely because there's no Navigator of the Seas there for a little bit of time. So that's the only reason that they're still planning to at least have over 1 million passengers come through the port in 2024. So it's still going to be a great year. for the Port of Los Angeles, of course, and just missing a few weeks of Navigator of the Seas is going to make that small little impact. But when of course you'd only get just a handful of ships, unlike some of these Florida ports here, when you only have a handful of ships, having one ship out of service, especially one that's year round, it'll make a big difference for you. So that's going to be all for today's video. What are your thoughts on the Mexican Riviera and sailing out of Los Angeles or Long Beach? Have you ever done that? Have you ever sailed to the Mexican Riviera? If so, what ship did you sail on and how did you like it? Being here in Florida, of course, having such easy access when I have a major cruise port like Canaveral just an hour away from me, I usually don't stray too far away from it. But I do want to sail one day out of the Port of Los Angeles or Long Beach. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. Have you ever sailed out of Long Beach or Los Angeles? Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.